What would you do? If one quiet afternoon, right outside your fence lay a dying girl, and behind her, 300 warriors riding hard toward your home. This isn't a legend. It's the moment that changed one man's life forever. Ezra Whitmore had long stopped expecting anything from life. Each morning he brewed coffee with his left hand because his right hand had held a gun for too many years. Each night he sat quietly on his porch, watching the desert swallow the sun in a blur of gold and rust, while memories of his wife gone too soon drifted like ghosts through the silence. He used to be a sheriff, a man of law, order, and steel. But the world had changed too fast, too cruel. One death, one wrong decision, one night he could never take back. And Ezra had walked away from it all. Now he lived alone out on the edge of nowhere, where the wind howled through dry grass like it was mourning something long forgotten. Till that day, he saw it first as a shape in the dust, a stain near his water well, maybe an injured deer, he thought, dragging his rifle from the wall as he stepped outside. But as he came closer, he saw the truth. A girl, no older than 16, native, Apache, her long black hair matted with blood, her skin pale from blood loss, torn clothes, bruises, fresh wounds. She was breathing, but just barely. She didn't speak English, but her eyes said everything: terror, pain, and the tiniest flicker of hope. Ezra didn't think. He didn't weigh the risks. He simply picked her up, carried her into his cabin, and began cleaning her wounds with whiskey cloth and trembling hands that hadn't touched another human in 5 long years. He had no way of knowing that she was Ayana, daughter of Nal Nish, one of the most powerful Apache war chiefs in the territory. And he had no way of knowing that, by saving her life, he had just summoned 300 Apache warriors to his doorstep. This isn't just a story about survival. It's about choosing what's right, even when you're completely, utterly alone. This is the story of Ezra Whitmore, a man who thought his life was over, until a girl in the dust gave him a reason to fight again. Ezra Whitmore didn't speak much anymore. Not to people, anyway. The wind, maybe. The occasional hawk circling over the mesa. And of course, the photograph on his wooden table, her face worn soft by time. Her eyes still catching the light just right at sunset. Sarah, his wife, the only person who ever made this wild, hard land feel like home. She'd been gone 5 years now. 5 years since Ezra buried her with his bare hands behind the house they'd built together beneath a crooked mesquite tree where she used to hang wind chimes. 5 years since the world stopped making sense and he stopped trying to fix it. He wasn't always this way. There was a time when folks called him Sheriff Whitmore, when his boots echoed on the wooden sidewalks of dusty towns, when his voice could quiet a saloon just by speaking. He carried the law like a cross back then, believing justice was something you could hold steady in your grip like a Colt revolver. But the law didn't save Sarah. It didn't stop the men who came in the night. He'd never talk about what happened, not to neighbors, not to the preacher, not even to the bottle. Whatever it was, it shattered something inside him. He laid down his badge the next day, packed what little he owned, and disappeared into the desert like a ghost searching for somewhere to die slowly. His ranch was simple. Just 1 room, 1 bed, 1 chair by the fireplace. The walls bore no decorations. The shelves held no books. Only the essentials tools, a few dried herbs, and his rifle always within reach. His days were filled with tasks, meant to keep his mind too tired to wander fencing, hauling water-mending saddles. His nights were filled with silence. But silence can be deceptive. It can feel like peace until you realize it's just loneliness in disguise. Ezra knew that. Still, he preferred the quiet to the noise of what-ifs and memories he couldn't change. He wasn't bitter, just hollow. Like the wind had blown through him one too many times and taken everything that mattered. And yet, he still kept the coffee warm. Still fed the horses even though he had nowhere to ride. Still lit a lantern each night even though he hadn't had a guest in years. There was a part of him buried deep beneath the dust and grief that hadn't entirely given up. Maybe he didn't know it. Maybe he didn't want to. But it was there, waiting. All it needed was a reason to rise, a spark, a moment. And one day as the sun bled red across the western sky, that moment came dragging itself through the dust on bloody knees, gasping for breath, collapsing just beyond his fence. Ezra thought he was alone. But fate had other plans. And it started with a girl in the dirt. At first Ezra thought it was a coyote, just a dark shape in the fading light, half buried in red sand near the water well. He squinted against the sun, hand instinctively resting on his rifle. Out here, things had a habit of dying quietly. Rabbits, deer men. The land didn't weep for anything. But as he stepped closer, the shape moved, not with instinct, but with desperation. A hand, small, human. Ezra's boots crunched the gravel as he hurried forward, his breath catching not from exertion, but from something deeper, something like fear. What he found on the ground wasn't an animal. It was a girl. She couldn't have been more than 16. Apache by the look of her. Dark hair tangled and sticky with dried blood. Face sunburned and hollow with thirst. Her lips were cracked. Her eyes half closed, fluttering like a dying flame. Ezra froze. Because in that moment every instinct screamed at him to walk away. This was trouble. Big trouble. A white man finding a native girl on his land, battered and bleeding. That wasn't a story that ended with gratitude. It was the kind of story that got a man hung from the nearest cottonwood. But then she opened her eyes, and what he saw there stopped the noise in his head. Not accusation, not fear, just pain, and a flicker of something he hadn't seen in a long, long time. Hope. She tried to speak, but the words came out in Apache, soft and broken. Ezra didn't understand a syllable, but he understood everything. She didn't need a translator. She needed mercy. He knelt beside her, rough hands trembling as they brushed sand from her cheek. "You're safe," he whispered, knowing full well he was lying. "You're gonna be all right." She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. She just closed her eyes again, as if trusting this stranger was the last thing her body could still do. Ezra scooped her up, surprised by how light she felt. She was barely more than bone and bruises. Her head lolled against his chest, and for a moment he imagined he was carrying his own daughter, if life had been different, if he'd ever had one. Back inside the cabin, he cleared his bed, laid her down gently, and moved like a man waking from a dream, boiling water, ripping cloth, pouring whiskey onto wounds that made his stomach twist. And as he worked, he spoke. He told her his name, told her she was safe, that he'd keep watch, that no one would hurt her here. He said it even though he had no idea if it was true. He said it because someone needed to. As night fell and her breathing steadied, Ezra sat beside her with the rifle across his knees, staring into the shadows outside. He had no answers, no plan, only this girl. And a storm he could feel coming thick in the desert wind. What he didn't know was that the storm was already here, and by dawn, it would arrive on horseback. The first thing Ezra noticed was the silence. Not the quiet kind he'd grown used to, the kind filled with wind and cicadas, and the creak of old wood under the sun. This was different. Heavy. Like the earth itself had gone still. Then came the sound. Horses, distant at first, then louder, then unmistakable. Ezra stood from his chair, the girl still unconscious, resting beneath a wool blanket on his bed. He moved to the window, every part of him tightening. What he saw made the breath catch in his throat. Silhouettes, dozens, then more. They rose from the edges of the desert like ghosts, quiet, precise, forming a wide circle around his small ranch, spreading across the dry creek bed, the rocky ridges, the edges of the bluff. By the time the sun broke over the horizon, Ezra had stopped counting. 20, 40, 70, more. By mid-morning they were everywhere. Warriors, Apache. They didn't shout, they didn't charge. They waited, watchful, still. Like wolves surrounding a wounded animal, only Ezra wasn't sure who the wounded one was. He turned back toward the girl, Ayana. That was her name. She'd whispered it just before slipping into sleep. She was stirring now, brow furrowed, hand twitching against the bandages he'd wrapped only hours before. She woke with a sharp breath, eyes darting. Fear hit her before the pain did. She sat up too quickly and winced, nearly collapsing back into the mattress. Ezra caught her gently. "Easy," he said. "You're safe. For now." He helped her to the window. When she saw them, hundreds of her own people outside the cabin encircling the land, her face went pale, not in relief, but in dread. She said something in Apache, then looked at Ezra, voice trembling but clear. "Father." It landed like a thunderclap. Ezra felt the floor tilt beneath him. This wasn't just any girl. She was the daughter of the man who now commanded the army outside. And if they thought he'd taken her, if they thought he'd harmed her, then mercy wouldn't even be a consideration. She began speaking rapidly in her language, pointing outside, then to her wounds, to Ezra, back again. It was urgent, desperate, but all Ezra could do was shake his head and whisper, "I don't understand." But even without the words, he knew what she was trying to say. They won't wait forever. Outside, the circle of warriors was shifting, tighter, closer, intent thick in the air like dust before a storm. And then a figure appeared on the ridge, larger than the rest, older, regal. Ezra didn't need to be told who he was. He could feel it. The Father had arrived, and with him came the weight of judgment. Her name was Ayana, and that name, spoken softly through cracked lips, changed everything. Ezra had found a wounded girl in the dust. But now she had a father, a name, a bloodline, and a nation at her back. The man on the ridge didn't move like a soldier. He moved like something older, deeper, a chiseled monument to centuries of survival. His headdress caught the breeze like the wings of a hawk, his posture straight as a pine hand's. Empty, but full of power. Ayana whispered again, "Nal Nish." Her voice trembled when she said it. Not with fear alone, but with something heavier, expectation, responsibility. Ezra turned toward her, trying to read the meaning behind her eyes. "He's your father." She nodded, then pointed to the hundreds of warriors waiting in the heat before placing a hand over her heart. He understood. This wasn't just a rescue. It was a political act, a spiritual one. She wasn't just someone's daughter, she was the daughter. The circle outside tightened again. From the window, Ezra could see the discipline in every step. No panic, no wasted movement. These weren't raiders. These were protectors, soldiers of tradition. And they'd come for their chief's daughter with the quiet fury of a people who had already buried too many children. But what tore at Ezra more than the danger was the look in Ayana's eyes. She wasn't afraid of her people. She was afraid for him. Something in her past, something in the days before she collapsed at his fence, made her resist going back. Her body bore the story, those scars too neat to be random, told of pain inflicted with purpose. And now, surrounded by her kin, her first instinct was not to run to them, but to stand beside him. She limped forward, pointing at her wounds, speaking fast in Apache. Her voice climbed, cracked, filled with urgency. Then she said his name, Ezra, 3 times. Loud, clear. Outside, the chief watched in silence, like a mountain watches the wind. And then from the ranks, one rider broke free. Younger, fiercer. He shouted something sharp, then, in English, "Send her out, or die." Ezra's fingers brushed his rifle. Reflex. But Ayana's hand landed on his arm, firm. She looked at him, then not as a stranger, but as something else. Not savior, not captor. Witness, ally, maybe even brother. Ezra's heart beat loud in his chest. He had never asked to be part of any story again. He had buried that need beside his wife. But this wasn't a story anymore. This was real. A girl stood between her past and his present, and the weight of who she was threatened to crush them both. And yet, she stood next to him. The desert had always been Ezra's refuge. Its emptiness gave him space to breathe, to forget. But now, it had become a stage. A quiet patch of land caught between 2 worlds, one where a white man had lived alone with his sorrow, the other where a proud nation demanded answers. Ayana stood beside him, her wounded body trembling, but her resolve unshaken. She was no longer a victim, and not yet a daughter returned. She was the bridge between them, and bridges Ezra knew bore all the weight. The warrior who had shouted earlier stepped forward again, his eyes sharp with fury. He was younger than the chief, but carried himself like someone used to being obeyed. Ayana said his name under her breath. Takakota. He's my father's war leader, she whispered. He does not trust. Ezra didn't blame him. From Takakota's view, this must have looked like a trap, a white man with the chief's daughter in his home, armed, silent, and guarded. For all he knew, Ezra could have been one of the men who hunted their people for profit. And yet, Ezra had done none of those things. He had offered help. Water, bandages, a bed he hadn't shared with another soul in 5 years. But intentions didn't matter much out here. Perception did. The desert had long been a place where mercy was mistaken for weakness, and hesitation could mean death. Ezra could see it in the way Takakota's hand hovered near the knife on his belt. He wasn't just angry, he was afraid of losing face, of losing his people, of making the wrong call in front of his chief. Chief Nal Nish remained still on his horse, watching like the sun, unblinking, eternal, and heavy with judgment. But his silence wasn't indifference. It was calculation, waiting for truth to reveal itself not through words, but through actions. Ezra stepped forward slowly, rifle lowered, hands visible. I didn't hurt her, he said, voice calm. I found her near dead outside my fence. I helped, that's all. Takakota spat in the dirt. White men always say that. It wasn't personal. It was history. The lies, the broken treaties, the raids, the daughters taken and never returned. Ezra knew he was bearing the weight of every betrayal his kind had ever dealt, every promise turned poison. But then Ayana stepped between them. She didn't speak with volume, but her voice carried. In Apache, fast and pleading, pointing to her scars, to Ezra's hands, to the chair he'd slept in while she took his bed. Takakota's eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. But he didn't speak, not right away. What Ayana said next, Ezra couldn't understand. But whatever it was, it landed heavy, because suddenly, Takakota looked at Ezra differently, not with trust, but with conflict, a kind of reluctant recognition. Ezra knew that look. It was the same one he saw in the mirror most mornings. I want to believe you, but I can't afford to be wrong. And in that fragile space between belief and betrayal, Chief Nal Nish finally dismounted. The silence broke like a dried twig beneath a boot, and everything that came next would decide not just Ezra's fate, but Ayana's honor and Takakota's trust. Chief Nal Nish moved like the earth itself, deliberate, grounded, impossible to ignore. Every eye followed him as he approached the cabin, each footstep echoing louder than the drums that had fallen silent hours before. Ezra stood still, heart hammering against his ribs. He wasn't afraid of dying. Not really. What haunted him more was the thought that everything he'd done, everything he'd risked to save Ayana, might be erased by a single misunderstanding. The chief stopped just 10 feet away, his hands visible, his face unreadable beneath the lines carved by sun and sorrow. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, my daughter says, you saved her life. He began his English slow but certain, that you asked for nothing, that you gave her your bed and whiskey for her wounds. She says you did not touch her, though she could not stop you. Ezra said nothing, just nodded slowly. Chief Nal Nish looked away, scanning the horizon as if searching for the weight of what came next. Many white men, he said, see weakness, take. You saw weakness and gave. Ezra swallowed hard. I didn't see weakness, he said softly. I saw a person, hurt, alone. I've been both. There was a flicker of something in the chief's eyes. Maybe pain, maybe recognition. Then he turned to face his war party and said something sharp in Apache. It sounded like a command, final and heavy. The air shifted. Ezra could feel it in his bones. A tension releasing, but not fully. As if one storm had passed, but another waited behind it. The chief turned back. I have told my warriors that you are under my protection, he said, "that any harm to you is harm to me." Ezra exhaled slow and trembling. But before relief could settle, Takakota rode forward, eyes blazing. He spoke fast and hard in Apache, pointing at Ezra, at Ayana, at the wide open land. His voice was a blade, and every word cut. Ayana whispered, "He says, you bring danger. That kindness is soft. That you could betray us, lead soldiers here. Like others have." Ezra didn't flinch. "He's right to worry," he said. "You don't know me." Takakota dismounted, stalking toward them. His presence was fire-hot, consuming, distrustful. But beneath it, Ezra saw something else, fear. Not for himself, but for his people. Then came the challenge. The chief spoke again. "Takakota says words are wind. He wants proof. He wants you to ride with us." Ezra blinked. "Ride where Snake Creek," the chief answered. "There is a camp. Slavers. White men who take women, children. Ayana was meant for them. But she escaped. Others won't. Not unless we stop them." Ezra's chest tightened. Slavers. He'd heard rumors, stories told in saloons, in hushed voices. But now, it had a name, a face, a scarred girl who still flinched in her sleep. "You want me to fight?" he asked quietly. The chief didn't answer, but Ayana did. She stepped forward, eyes wet but steady. "Not fight," she said. "Choose." And in that one word, Ezra saw the truth. Saving her was mercy. But mercy meant nothing if it didn't have the strength to defend what it loved. They rode at dusk. Ezra hadn't been on a horse in years, not since Sarah died. But his hands remembered, even if his heart trembled. The saddle creaked beneath him as the war party moved in silence through the canyon, each rider a shadow against the crimson sky. No war cries, no torches, just focus, purpose, and beside him, Ayana, alive, determined, changed. The landscape grew harsher the farther they rode, sharp rock-twisted trees, sand that swallowed hooves without warning. But the Apache moved through it like wind through reeds. Ezra did his best to keep up his breath, catching in the thin desert air. His rifle strapped across his back, his mind thick with questions. He wasn't a soldier anymore. He wasn't even sure he'd ever been a warrior. But he knew this. He could no longer pretend not to care. Not after what he'd seen. Not after what they'd told him. Snake Creek. A place that sounded harmless. But what waited there was rot. A slaver camp tucked into the bend of a shallow stream, hidden from the world, trading in lives like cattle. Ezra had pictured it in his mind, then hated himself for how accurately he'd guessed. When they reached the ridge overlooking the camp, he saw it all. Wagons with iron bars, cages, children, women with blank eyes and bruised skin. 15 guards armed, laughing, unaware of what was coming. Ezra felt something shift inside him. Not rage, something colder. A clarity. Chief Nal Nish crouched beside him, pointing to the far end of the camp. "Distraction comes from the north. You go with Takakota. Free the cages when the shooting starts." Ezra nodded. No questions, no hesitation. He crawled down the rocks with Takakota's team heart pounding with every breath. Each sound, each crunch of sand felt deafening, but no one spoke. Not even Ayana, who moved ahead like a whisper. Then gunfire. Sharp, sudden, from the north. Screams, horses, chaos. The guards rushed to meet the attack, leaving the wagons exposed just like the plan. Ezra ran. He reached the first cage, saw 3 young women cowering inside. "We're here to help," he whispered, fumbling with the lock. Their eyes didn't believe him. Why should they? But they waited. Metal finally gave. The door swung open. They ran. Another cage. Another lock. Another face behind bars. Ezra worked fast, hands shaking, not from fear, but from fury. He'd seen men like these slavers before, but never their victims, never their horror up close. Then came the shouting. Slavers returning. Ezra turned. 3 men, guns raised. He lifted his rifle, fired once, missed. But Takakota was there. 2 clean shots, 1 knife thrown. Silence. "Move," he shouted. "Help them run." And Ezra did, carried a woman who couldn't walk, shielded a child with his body. His legs burned, his arms ached, but he didn't stop. Because this time he wasn't alone, and this time he wasn't afraid. When the last gunshot faded into the dusk, the silence that followed wasn't peace. It was grief. Ezra stood among the wreckage of the slavers' camp, blood on his sleeves, dust on his face, his chest rising and falling in heavy bursts. The fighting was over. The cages had been opened. But what had spilled out from them wasn't just bodies. It was the weight of suffering. Women huddled together, arms wrapped around one another like shields. Some wept. Others didn't make a sound, not because they weren't hurting, but because the pain had already pushed past words. Children sat in stunned silence, their small frames trembling with exhaustion and fear. Ezra had seen battle before. He'd witnessed death, but he had never seen what happened after the guns came off, after the monsters were gone. He moved between the freed captives with a canteen in one hand, a blanket in the other, unsure where to begin. One young woman, barely more than a girl, shrank from him until she saw Ayana beside him. Only then did she reach out and take the water, her hands shaking too hard to lift it. Ezra held it for her. Nearby, a mother clutched a child with a bloodied foot. Ezra tore a strip of fabric from his own shirt, knelt, and began binding the wound. The woman didn't speak English, but she nodded once, eyes wide, with something between gratitude and disbelief. It wasn't just the injuries that cut deep. It was the emptiness in their eyes. These people hadn't just been hurt. They'd been discarded, like they were never meant to be found. Ezra's stomach turned as he looked back toward the cages, blackened with smoke, some of them still reeking of urine and fear. He ran a hand over one of the iron bars, cold and twisted from gunfire. This was no isolated cruelty. This had been a system. He remembered the rumors now. Men whispering in saloons about wagon trains that weren't carrying grain or tools, but merchandise. Girls taken from border towns. Apache women snatched in the night. Mexican children never seen again. And now it had faces. He looked over to Takakota, who stood alone for a moment, staring out at the desert as if trying to breathe again. Then to Chief Nal Nish, who moved slowly among the freed, speaking in low tones, placing a hand on a shoulder, reminding his people that they were still people. Ayana approached quietly, her steps stronger now. She stopped beside Ezra, looking out over the camp. "This," she whispered, "is what they wanted me for." Ezra felt something collapse inside him. Not rage, not vengeance, shame. Because she wasn't just talking about the men in this camp. She was talking about his people, his kind, the ones who called themselves civilized. He turned to her, voice hoarse. "I didn't know." She nodded. "Now, you do." And with that knowing came a responsibility that Ezra hadn't expected, but could no longer avoid. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the broken camp. The kind of light that softens even the harshest edges, except there was nothing soft left in Ezra Whitmore. Not after what he'd seen. He sat on a boulder near the creek, binding the shallow wound on his arm, more a graze than a scar. Around him, the Apache warriors moved with quiet efficiency, checking the freed prisoners, burying the dead, burning what couldn't be salvaged. No one celebrated. There was no triumph in this kind of justice, only necessity. Takakota approached in silence, his rifle slung over his back. His face unreadable in the dimming light, Ezra stood, uncertain, expecting perhaps a final word of warning, or at best, a nod of respect. Instead, Takakota reached out his hand. Rough, calloused, the hand of a man who worked the land, fought for his people, bled for something bigger than himself. "You ride with us," he said. "You fight with us. You bleed with us." He paused, searching for the words in English. "You are Apache brother now." Ezra stared at the outstretched hand, stunned into stillness. He wasn't sure he deserved it. He wasn't sure he ever would. But he knew this: there are some moments that don't wait for your permission. There are debts you didn't know you owed, and names you didn't know you could carry, until someone else hands them to you, not out of charity, but out of recognition. He took Takakota's hand, gripped it hard, said nothing, because there was nothing to say that could carry the weight of that gesture. Chief Nal-Nish stood watching, his expression solemn. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, but carried like thunder across the canyon. "You chose not to look away," he said. "That is not common." Then, after a pause, "You chose pain that is not yours, and now it is yours." Ezra nodded, the words settling into him like truth. He glanced at Ayana. She stood at the edge of the clearing, speaking softly to one of the younger women they had rescued. Her presence, calm, protective, almost maternal. There was strength in her now, not just survival. She caught his eye and offered a small, tired smile. Not of gratitude, but of trust. Behind her, the campfires were being lit, not as signals of war, but as circles of warmth, of food, of healing. Ezra knew he'd be welcome at one. He also knew he'd never sit at it the same man he'd been before. Because you don't walk into fire and come out unchanged. And you don't get to carry the name brother just because you showed up. You earn it with sweat, with risk, with choices made when no one's watching. That night, beneath the stars and beside strangers who no longer felt like strangers, Ezra didn't sleep. He kept his fire small, his rifle close, and his heart open. 3 days later, Ezra Whitmore sat on his porch, a cup of black coffee cradled in his hands. The desert stretched out before him, wide and golden, the kind of stillness that once echoed his loneliness. But today, it felt different. Quieter, yes, but not empty. Not hollow. Something had shifted. Not out there, but in here. On the small table beside him lay a simple object, a bracelet. Woven leather and carved bone, delicate yet firm. Apache made. A gift from Ayana, left in silence the morning they parted ways. He hadn't known what to say when she gave it to him. Still didn't. But he kept it there next to Sarah's photograph. One a memory. The other, a reminder that sometimes we're given a second chance at being the kind of person we once thought we'd lost the strength to be. Ezra reached for the bracelet, thumb brushing the smooth curve of bone. No ceremony, no speech. Just that quiet moment when a man chooses who he'll be when no one's watching. Because that was the lesson. Not from the fight. Not even from the fire. But from the girl in the dust who looked at him and saw something good, even when he couldn't. He didn't ride with the Apache for glory. He didn't help those women and children for redemption. He did it because when the moment came, he could no longer pretend not to care. And that perhaps was what made the difference. Inside the cabin, life remained simple. One bed, one chair, one rifle on the wall. But now there was a promise too. That if evil ever crossed his land again, if someone else came limping out of the dusk with blood on their face and hope in their eyes, Ezra Whitmore would rise. Not because anyone would know, not because he'd be thanked, but because doing the right thing has nothing to do with being seen. It has everything to do with choosing to see. And if that bracelet ever wore thin from age or time, well, the memory it carried would not. It would live on in stories whispered by campfires, in the scars of survivors, and in the hearts of those who believe that even in the harshest places, mercy still matters. So, if you've made it this far, ask yourself, what kind of person are you when no one's watching? And if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember that quiet courage still exists, and that sometimes heroes aren't born in battle. They're born in silence, when a man kneels beside a stranger and chooses kindness anyway. Subscribe to this channel for more stories that dig deep into courage, redemption, and the power of small choices. And when you're ready, click on the next video, a tale even more unexpected, where a man waiting for his bride opens his door to find an entire tribe instead. You won't want to miss it.